Well, okay, welcome back to our first main keynote session of today. It's great that so many of you were able to come here from so many different parts of the world, of course, and to bring the weather with you. There's a very un-English weather that we have here for the moment, so enjoy it while you can. So I'm very delighted this afternoon to introduce Jodi Dean for today's main keynote address. Jodi is Professor of Political Science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in the United States. And I first got wind of her ascent as a key critical thinker in the early 1990s when Aletta Norval met Jodi in a conference in Prague. And just about the first thing she said to me on her return to Culture was, "I've met this fantastic, amazing new theorist, and we must invite her to come to the center and speak as soon as she can." And we were lucky that Jodi was able to visit our department shortly afterwards and give a talk there. And I'm very happy to say again that today she has once again accepted our invitation to speak at the new Center for Ideology and Discourse Analysis and to participate in our conference. Professor Dean has published a series of path-breaking books and articles on the pressing issues of our time, and has engaged with and developed the writings of theorists such as Jürgen Habermas, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, Slavoj Žižek, and many others. She is the current editor of Theory and Event and an acute observer and commentator of the incipient trends and trajectories of contemporary politics. She is the author of many books, of which you know, including Aliens in America, Publicity Secret, Blog Theory, The Communist Horizon, Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies, and more recently, Crowds and Party, where she argues for a vision of leftist politics with a renewed focus on the political party as a key vehicle for lasting social change. Jodi embodies the idea of a critical political theorist whose work is both theoretically sophisticated and thoroughly engaged in the task of exposing the key dangers that face us in the contemporary world. She is also not afraid to set out alternative visions for our societies, as well as the means for their realization. She is thus an ideal speaker for this year's conference and for the Center of Ideology and Discourse Analysis, and we very much look forward to listening and engaging with her thoughts this afternoon. Thank you, Jodi.
So now I'm trying to decide, I guess I shouldn't stand behind that, right? Because that's going to look sort of weird. I mean, I won't be able to see me. Okay, so thanks so much to David for the introduction, and a special thanks also to Jimena and Kostis for all of their hard work on the conference. I'm really happy to be part of it, and I appreciate all of their efforts. Okay, so my remarks today are inspired by Mackenzie Work's provocative thought experiment. What if we're not in capitalism anymore, but something worse? She's been pushing this for a while, and she develops it in a new book that's coming out from Verso in the fall. So I'm going to answer Work with a variation on Rosa Luxemburg's choice between socialism or barbarism. My wager is that today our choice is between communism or neo-feudalism. Now, to be clear, by communism, since we're in Essex, I do not mean the end of politics in a fully reconciled totality. I accept the Lacanian view of the irreducibility of antagonism. Communism does not abolish politics. It's the form for the replacement of production for the sake of the capital accumulation of the few with production for the sake of meeting the needs of the many. A form for the collective self-emancipation of the proletarianized, as Marx says in the Civil War in France, discussing the Paris Commune. So I accept Work's provocation, and I'm going to draw out the tendencies in the present that point beyond capitalism to something worse. A neo-feudalism of new lords and new serfs, a micro-elite of platform billionaires, and the massive service sector or sector of servants. Our present is at a crossroads, communism or neo-feudalism. Neo-feudalism names the something worse that capitalism has become and is becoming. Now, I'm going to say more about the big picture before I give you the attributes of neo-feudalism. By naming this something worse that capitalism is right now, right, this something worse that we're in, by naming this neo-feudalism, I'm rejecting the idea that the big confrontation today is between democracy and populism. This deflects attention from the fundamental role of globally networked communicative capitalism in exacerbating popular anger and discontent. It prevents us from considering why ostensibly democratic societies are turning to the right. And the reason's economic. Complex networks produce extremes of inequality. Winner take all or winner take most distributions. People's lives become more desperate and uncertain. As more and more people experience loss and dispossession, they want something to hold on to and someone to blame. The right offers an identity wrapped around nation, church, and family. It directs anger against threats to this identity: immigrants, secularist liberals, feminists, and sexual minorities. Thinking in terms of neo-feudalism moves us away from the stage of identity and forces us to confront the impact of extreme economic inequality on political society and institutions. It makes us reckon with the fact of billionaires hoarding trillions of dollars of assets and walling themselves into their own enclaves while millions become climate refugees and billions face diminished life prospects, struggling just to survive. By calling tendencies in our present neo-feudal, I'm also signaling a change in labor relations. Today, the ideal of freely contracted labor that justifies and conceals coercive class relations, this ideal is now untenable. Not even the barest fantasy of freely given consent accounts for the social relations of capital accumulation today. Most have no choice but to work. Many have no work to choose. In the service-dominated economies of the global north, majorities work in service sectors. Some enjoy the fantasy that their service is creative, that they're members of a privileged class of knowledge workers, yet much of that work is increasingly done for free, maybe for a chance of pay. Knowledge workers, like day laborers, often have to compete for contracts. If they win, then they can work for a wage. Most of us constitute a propertyless underclass, only able to survive by servicing the needs of high earners, say as personal assistants, trainers, childminders, cooks, cleaners, etc. The waged are further expropriated of their minimal incomes via unavoidable debts, fines, fees, and rents. In the US, taxes on people are redistributed to corporations. In 2018, 57 corporations, including Amazon, not only didn't pay taxes, but received money back. They got tax rebates. The US government squeezes its citizens for money to pay out to corporations. Neo-feudalism is not a conservative devolution into a previous political economic form. It's a result, effect, and product of capitalism. It's a continuation and reflexivization of imperialism. Recall, Lenin conceived imperialism in terms of the global effects of monopolies and financial capitalism. Today, communicative capitalism's complex networks intensify these processes and turn them back on the dominant economies. As I'll explain, the structure of complex networks demonstrates why contemporary capitalism tends toward neo-feudalism. Complex networks intensify hierarchy under the guise of free choice and democratic participation. Practices associated with democracy, like free speech and discussion, concentrate and detach themselves into affective networks where politics is reduced to the daily outrage. Liberated from democratic chains, yet still cloaked in democratic legitimacy, the state is refined as an instrument of coercive force. In the US, this has meant funding prisons, not schools, building up police, but not basic infrastructure like bridges and roads, and subsidizing corporations, not social services. One last bit. In the Marxist-Leninist tradition, part of the optimism around communism stemmed from how it was supposed to arise out of capitalism, how it would rest on the fixed capital and organizational and infrastructural capacities generated by the capitalist mode of production. Even as crises of overproduction always lead to immense waste and destruction, it seemed hard to believe that the bourgeoisie would oversee the dismantling of society. The new lords of the Anthropocene, the billionaires of finance, technology, media, real estate, shipping, and fossil fuels, have no such hesitation. In their self-interest, they prefer the destruction of the world to the diminution of their vast fortunes. In this phase of absolute subsumption, capitalism turns in on itself as a mode of waste, hoarding, and destruction, where capital is accumulated as much via expropriation, rents, debts, and fines as it is by exploitation. So that's the overall argument. Now I'm going to go into the details. And so what I'm first going to do is give 4 interlocking features of neo-feudalism. So I'll just tell you these 4 features. Parcelization of sovereignty, hierarchy and expropriation with new lords and serfs, that's the second one. The third one is desolate hinterlands and privileged municipalities. And the fourth is insecurity and catastrophism. So I'm going to introduce, I'll talk about all 4 of these, and I'll repeat the things each time. So I start with parcelization of sovereignty. The Marxist historians Perry Anderson and Ellen Meiksins-Wood emphasize the parcelization of sovereignty as a key feature of feudalism. 2 aspects are important for understanding neo-feudalism: fragmentation and extra economic coercion. So, with respect to fragmentation, state functions are vertically and horizontally fragmented. Local arrangements start to take a variety of forms. Different sorts of political and economic authorities claim right in jurisdiction. Arbitration and compromise take the place of the rule of law. The line between legal and illegal becomes weaker. Second, and consequently, political authority and economic exploitation blend together. Feudal lords extracted a surplus from the peasants through legal coercion, and it was legal in part because the lords got to decide that the law that applies to the peasants in their jurisdiction. Neo-feudal lords, like global financial institutions, use debt to redistribute wealth from the world's poorest to the richest. Recall, also, 10% of global wealth is hoarded in offshore accounts to avoid taxation. In other words, to escape the reach of state law. Likewise, the largest tech companies have valuations greater than the economies of most of the world's countries. And so cities and countries relate to Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google as if they were sovereign states. They negotiate with them, they try to attract them, they cooperate with them on their terms. For the most part, these companies can evade the law, they can afford to spend years in litigation, and they can bend laws to suit their will. Multi-million-dollar fees are not deterrents for companies with valuations of close to $1 trillion. In the same vein, foreign investors have the right to sue governments in international tribunals. They often do this when public interest regulations, democratically decided public interest regulations that are designed to protect water, communities, and environments, when these start to threaten to reduce the value of their investments. So, for example, a large number of these cases have been brought by Canadian mining exploration firms against Latin American governments. According to Manuel Perez Roca and Jen Moore, quote, "The corporations are allowed to bypass domestic courts and sue governments before private tribunals such as the World Bank-affiliated International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. The tribunal members are highly paid corporate lawyers who have no obligation to consider the rights of local communities or the importance of health and environmental protections, end quote. So private tribunals take the place of state law. Another example, big corporations often make the signing away of legal claims a condition of employment. So employees waive their right to sue, agreeing to use private arbitration to resolve differences. Another instance of parcellated sovereignty, because there are different rules of law, different determinations of justice, depending on specific relations to specific employers. Sovereignty is parcellated, fragmented on domestic fronts as well. Palestine is a clear example, as Israeli settlers illegally build up settlements on Palestinian land under the protection of Israeli military forces. An example from the US, cash-strapped communities use elaborate systems of fines to expropriate money from people directly, of course impacting poor people the hardest. In her recent book, Punishment Without Crime, Alexandra Nadapoff documents the dramatic scope of misdemeanor law in the already enormous US carceral system. Poor people, disproportionately people of color, are arrested on bogus charges and convinced to plead guilty to avoid the jail time that they would incur if they contest the charges and lose. So not only does the guilty plea go on their record, but they start to accrue fines that if they can't afford to pay, will turn into more fines and more charges. We got a brief look into the system of legal illegality and the unjust administration of justice in the wake of the riots in Ferguson, Missouri, that followed the murder of Michael Brown. Quote, and this is from Alexandra Nadapoff, "The city's municipal court and policing apparatus openly extracted millions of dollars from its low-income African-American population. Police were instructed to make arrests and issue citations in order to raise revenue. Like the minions of feudal lords, they used force to expropriate value from the people." Last example. Keep in mind that lordship designates a social relation for the appropriation of surplus. Are we not in that same relation with the owners of communicative capitalism's media platforms? They appropriate the surplus generated by our use, the data and metadata that accompanies our communicative interactions. Through networked personal communication devices, the social substance is appropriated, stored, and mined for the extraction of the resource, data. What was common becomes private, expropriated from us not simply via user fees, but also through feedback, data, and metadata generated by our networked lives. Okay, the second now characteristic of neo-feudalism is hierarchy and expropriation, or peasants and lords. So feudal relations are characterized by a fundamental inequality. Ellen Wood emphasizes that the distinct feature of feudalism in the West is the exploitation of peasants by lords in the context of parcelized sovereignty. Perry Anderson reminds us of exploitative monopolies, such as water mills, that were controlled by the lord. Peasants were obliged to have their grain ground at their lord's mill, a service for which they had to pay. So not only did peasants occupy and till land that they did not own, but they dwelled under conditions where the feudal lord was, as Marx says, the manager and master of the process of production and of the entire process of social life. Now, it's not quite right to say that the present's characterized by peasants and lords, even though some countries, like England, still have aristocracies. But it is right to say that contemporary capitalist society is characterized by an intensification of inequality. More billionaires, greater distance between rich and poor, the solidification of a differentiated legal system that protects corporations and the rich while it immiserates and incarcerates the poor. The entrenchment of class inequality is severe. I mean, the US actually has less economic mobility than England, even though you guys still have a landed aristocracy. This intensification of inequality has accompanied a personalization of consumption. Not all consumers are the same. Some are like loyal retainers who pledge loyalty to a corporation in exchange for points, discounts, benefits, and other rewards for their service as customers. Operating as a global aristocracy and world-ruling class, the super-rich are increasingly protected from the rest of us. Their planes are private, their schools are private, their clubs are private. They've got their own private security forces with their own bodyguards. More significant, though, are the ways that their fortunes are made through the proliferation of mechanisms of direct expropriation. Bank fees for every possible transaction, illegal foreclosures and evictions, the disaggregation of services into separate chargeable elements, direct wage theft, which is frequent, widespread, and impossible for people who can't afford lawyers to address. The finance sector systematically takes from the poor to give to the rich. And of course, it's necessary once again to mention the tech sector, which takes our data, whether we share it or not, and aggregates and mines and sells it in the contemporary equivalent of the water mill. At this point, we need our phones and internet. We cannot not choose our own expropriation. Third characteristic, cities and hinterlands. So a third feature then of neo-feudalism is its spatiality, a spatiality of often protected, lively centers surrounded by agricultural and desolate hinterlands. We could also characterize this as a split between town and country, municipal and rural areas, urban communes and the surrounding countryside, or more abstractly, an inside walled off from an outside, a division between what is secured and what is endangered, who is prosperous and who is desperate. Wood says that medieval cities were essentially oligarchies, quote, with dominant classes enriched by commerce and financial services for kings, emperors, and popes. Collectively, they dominated the surrounding countryside, extracting wealth from it in one way or another, end quote. Anderson describes the feudal division between town and country as a dynamic opposition between commodity and natural production. Correlative to this division are the nomads and migrants who, facing unbearable conditions, seek new places to live and work, yet all too often come up against the walls. Their real conditions at the edge of survival become mirrored back to them in the fears of the protected, who can never be safe enough. Politically, the desperation of the hinterlands manifests in the movements of those outside the cities, movements that are sometimes around environmental issues like fracking and pipeline struggles, movements sometimes around land like privatization and expropriation of land, sometimes around the reduction of services, the shutting down of hospitals and schools. In the US, the politics of guns is also a matter of the hinterlands against the urban. We might also note the way that the division between hinterlands and municipality gets reinscribed within cities themselves. It manifests both in the abandonment of poor areas and in their eradication in capitalist gentrification land grabs. Finally, we could note the increased prominence of social reproduction theory as a response to hinterlandization. That is, a response to the loss of a general capacity to reproduce the basic conditions of livable life. This appears in rising suicide rates, drug addiction, declining birth rates, lower rates of life expectancy, and in the US, in the psychotic societal self-destruction of mass shootings. It appears in the collapsed infrastructures and undrinkable water. The hinterlands are written on people's bodies and on the land. With closures of hospitals and schools and the diminution of basic services, life becomes more desperate and uncertain. Teachers' strikes in the US have made their primary issues not simply better salaries, although these matter, but also better conditions for students, for children. Phil Neal's recent book, Hinterland, notes patterns between China, Egypt, Ukraine, and the United States. They're all places with desolate, abandoned wastelands and cities on the brink of overload. Neil's account of the stratification and struggle across the international periphery echoes arguments made by international relations scholars 30 years earlier. Already in 1998, Philip Czerny was writing of the, quote, growing alienation between global innovation, communication and resource nodes, global cities, on the one hand, and disfavored, fragmented hinterlands on the other. Czerny warned of the resulting exclusion and lumpenization. As large geographical spaces are starved of infrastructure and support, he said, many people will simply be out of the loop. Country bumpkins or even roaming deprived bands forced once again to become predators or supplicants on the cities as in the Middle Ages, end quote. And now the last of the four categories of neo-feudalization is insecurity and apocalypticism. I think of this characteristic as affective and subjective, right? It involves the deep kind of anxiety. And I think that this affective orientation around sort of insecurity, anxiety, apocalypticism, that it links the first three categories together. And there's good reason to feel insecure. The catastrophe of capitalist expropriation of the social surplus in the setting of a warming planet is real. So now, to be clear, I am not making a historical argument about feudalism's fundamental structure, and I am not making an empirical claim about all existing feudalisms. Rather, the four elements of past European feudalism, parcelization of sovereignty, hierarchy and expropriation, cities and hinterland, and insecurity and apocalypticism, these characteristics are relevant to present trajectories. They let us see the present not as capitalist, but as something worse, a neo-feudalism born of capitalist processes as they intensify and turn back on themselves. Now, some might argue, or some might suspect, that my argument for neo-feudalism is non-Marxist. And they might associate Marxism with a reductive, determinist theory of stages and transition, where capitalism comes out of feudalism, and the next stage is necessarily socialism. That's not my view, and it's not Marx's view either. Marx was much more nuanced. He acknowledged the coexistence of different modes of production and the ways this coexistence could intensify specific tendencies in the different modes, making domination and immiseration even worse. In a related vein, Rosa Luxemburg drew out capitalism's reliance on non-capitalist modes external to it. The primitive accumulation that Marx places in the feudal period is an ongoing characteristic of capitalism. Direct appropriation, rather than exchange, is a feature of capitalism. It's not a bug, it's not an exception. In a discussion of feudal-appearing elements in Latin America, Andrew Gunter Frank furthers this discussion. What appears as feudal is an effect of economic development under capitalism, in this instance, and the one that Frank is discussing, imperialism. So what I want to emphasize here is that feudalization is a continuation of the logic of imperialism. The discussion of racial capitalism, particularly in the US, this discussion is also undergirded by a similar assumption. Capitalism was never about equivalent exchange. That was always a bourgeois fiction. Capitalism relies on force, extraction, dispossession, and entrenched heritable hierarchies. Okay, so Lenin theorized imperialism as an intensification of capital concentration, monopolies, and financial oligarchy. Today's complex networks, digital, communication, information, they amplify these tendencies towards inequality as they result in power law distributions. Now this is a sort of technical point, but it's crucial for the argument. In his book Linked, Albert Laszlo Barabasi sets out the formal characteristics of power law distributions in complex networks. Complex networks are networks characterized by free choice, growth, and preferential attachment. So that means these are networks where people voluntarily make links or choices. The number of links per site or per item, per thing, grow over time, And people like things because others like them. Like, that's the preferential attachment part. So, for example, it's generally the case that the most popular book or restaurant or internet site has roughly twice as many links or hits as the second most popular, which has twice as many as the third, and so on, down to the insignificant differences between those low in the food chain, those in the long tail of the distribution curve. This winner-take-all or winner-take-most effect is the power law shape of the distribution. The one at the top has significantly more than the ones at the bottom. So the distribution shape is not a bell curve, it's a long tail. The most popular people on Twitter have over 100 million followers. Those ranked around 9 or 10 have around 50 million, and the average person has about 200. Another example of the same distribution pattern. Think of a workplace or organization where 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Or classrooms or seminars or activist groups where some people take up all the space. A small number tend to do most of the talking. Making the space equal requires an intervention. The structure of complex networks induces competition for attention, resources, money, jobs, anything that's given a networked form. And it leads to concentration. Free choice, growth, and preferential attachment produce hierarchies, power law distributions where those at the top have vastly more than those at the bottom. Another way to make this point, hierarchies are immanent to networks. They are not transcendental impositions. Getting rid of them, combating them, requires an imposition, a cut, a beheading, a disruption of the system that produces them. Right? Abolishing immanent hierarchies, in other words, requires politics. If we think of digital networks as turning us into constant producers of communicative capitalism's primary resource, data, we gain further insight into neo-feudalization. It's like we cannot escape subjection. The classic Marxist distinction between feudalism and capitalism was that feudalism relied on direct expropriation, and capitalism relied on free workers freely selling their labor power. Marx was clear that this fiction broke down in the hidden abode of the factory, where there was no equality between capitalist and worker. He was also clear on the role of colonialism and the slave trade for the development of capitalism. In the networked social factory, even the fiction of free production has dissolved. To communicate and interact and even move through social space generates data for another, not ourselves. Our lives and interactions have been turned into resources for capital accumulation. Under neo-feudalism, the fictions of the bourgeois state break down, and the directly political character of society reasserts itself. We see this clearly in the primacy of the police and the corporation. In intensely racist societies like the United States, as well as in the wake of decades of movement struggle around sex, race, and ethnicity, it's hard to imagine that bourgeois fictions of freedom and equality could ever legitimate market relations. Today, the rich and white no longer feel compelled to justify their unfair shares. The burden is on the unfortunate to demonstrate why they should get anything at all. At any rate, my point is that imperialism has turned in on itself such that monopoly capital can force states to cut taxes, provide rebates and incentives, and produce treaties that replace state courts with private tribunals. Dependent on capital, states sell off public properties and assets, look for deals to attract developers, and pursue strategies that court the rich and displace the poor. Okay, so if my wager's correct, right, this neo-feudalism wager's correct, then what's the communist alternative, right? What does it look like? Put differently, how might thinking in terms of neo-feudalism inflect left politics? One of the problems that we face on the left today, I don't know if I'm supposed to turn this yet, maybe I'll do it anyway. So one of the problems that we face on the left today is that some of the ideas with the most support reinforce neo-feudalism, or they fail to confront it because they're trapped within its imaginary. So localism affirms parcelization. Municipalism affirms the urban-rural divide. Emphases on subsistence and survival proceed as if peasant economies were plausible not only for that half of the planet that lives in cities, which include 82% of North Americans and 74% of Europeans, but as if those were plausible also for the millions displaced by climate change, war, and commercial land theft. The problem for most dwelling in the hinterlands is that their political, cultural, and economic conditions are such that they can't make a living through agriculture. Right? Approximately 50 countries are classified as low-income food deficit countries. Most will bear the initial brunt of the changing climate, and most are in Africa. UBI, Universal Basic Income, is a similarly untenable survivalist approach. It promises just enough to keep those in the hinterlands going, so long as they don't go to the cities where they can't afford to live. The fourth element, insecurity and apocalypse, takes shape as that left catastrophism, preoccupied with extinction and the end of the world, as if the next few hundred years just don't matter. Taken together, these positions, right, this sort of, omitted somewhat parodic version of the contemporary left with those positions. Taken together, though, they suggest a vision of the future comprised of small groups and communes engaged in subsistence farming and the production of artisanal cheese, perhaps on the edges of cities where survivalist enclaves and drone-wielding tech workers all experiment with urban gardens. Such groupings reproduce their lives in common, yet the commons they reproduce is necessarily small, local, and to a certain extent exclusive and elite. Exclusive insofar as their numbers are necessarily limited. Elite because the aspirations are culturally specific rather than widespread. It's like the basic view of the future is cool cities surrounded by organic farms with little attention to farming's mode of production, right? Did the farmers choose to be farmers, or were they born that way? Do they own the land? Do they share it? Do they export their products? And what about the hidden conditions that make the cool cities possible? The builders, the cleaners, the maintainers of infrastructure, the providers of transportation and communication, the carers for health, education, and children. Are the cities cool for them too? The way that some popular left ideas converge is via an abandonment of hinterlands, abandonment of rural areas and small cities that have been left behind, and a cultivation of those elements of the urban that benefit the rich and educated, our robot future. Far from a vision anchored in the emancipation of the working class, this model can't even see a working class, even when it's right before their eyes as the service sector that supports every aspect of contemporary life. Instead, left enthusiasm for robots and urban gardens gives us a vision that boils down to a wealthy fortress surrounded by a combination of farms and wastelands. When work is imagined, and some on the left want to say that we should adopt a post-work imaginary, but when it's imagined, it looks like either romantic risk-free farming or tech work, immaterial labor. And what has been erased is industry, manufacturing, the production and maintenance of infrastructure, as well as the wide array of labor necessary for social reproduction. Given that most cities are on coasts, this model lacks the foresight necessary for responding to climate change. A better version of the future has to begin there, and that means imagining not just alternative energy, but new ways of living for the hundreds of thousands or millions who will lose their livelihood once it's clear that the fossil fuels have to be kept in the ground. We also have to imagine an end to the rural-urban divide, that is a change in the patterns of urbanization and in the division between mental and physical labor. Vastly expanded cooperative science and research, the development and production of new modes of transportation and new practices of dwelling, new approaches to cleaning up, repairing, or transforming areas damaged by extractivism. Common tasks can be exciting and invigorating, especially when they are understood as common and when commoning is more than farming and housework. So I'm going to conclude very briefly with a couple of communist alternatives to feudalism, though I've already gestured to some. Parcelization needs to be understood not in terms of localism, but as the weakening of the nation state necessary for communist universalism. It has to be rendered not as fragmentation and separation, but as conduits for a new internationalism. Transnational organizations, from financial institutions, corporations, and social media platforms, to parties, issue alliances, and political formations, these suggest the plausibility of communizing structures across and beyond nation states. The only problem is that they currently serve capitalist rather than communist ends. But it's not hard to imagine them repurposed as components of a diverse communist ecosystem, one devoted not to capital accumulation and protecting the hoards and privileges of billionaires, but to the emancipatory, egalitarian flourishing of the many. Getting there, of course, requires political struggle, right? The capitalist class doesn't just roll over. But parcelization reminds us that their power is much more fragile than we often acknowledge. And it gives us a way to think about international communist organizations as a complex tangle of associations operating in ways that exceed the simple geometry of vertical and horizontal, or the cliched geography of local and global. With respect to cities and hinterlands, the end of an economy of capital accumulation makes possible the dissolution of the rural-urban divide and the division of labor that drives it. More concretely and immediately, with a vision of communism mindful of the hinterlands, we open up new possibilities for organized struggle that build from current tendencies. And you could think here of like the Maoist strategy of surrounding the cities. At any rate, the intensifying politics around migration and refugees, the class struggles unfolding in various forms on the outskirts of cities, and the growing anger of the hinterlands dispossessed that we see vividly in France and in the electoral politics driving the rightward shift in the US, Hungary, Poland, Canada, I think here and elsewhere, give us a setting of real struggle that's not yet decided. So there's nothing inevitable about the shift to the right. It's a matter of organizing, of offering a politics, a communist politics, that speaks to a wide array of human needs and concerns, and that offers a possibility of flourishing. So to sum up, I've argued that we are not in capitalism anymore, but something worse, neo-feudalism. This does not mean that there are no longer capitalist relations of production and exploitation. It means that the other dimensions of capitalist production, expropriation, domination, and force, have become stronger to such an extent that it no longer makes sense to posit free and equal market actors meeting in the labor market even as a governing fiction. Just as Lenin's account of imperialism as a stage of capitalism made clear that there were still capitalist relations, but in a new form, one where monopoly, finance, and the territorial division of the world necessitated another analysis, so might neo-feudalism lead us to a different appreciation of the forces communicative capitalism has itself produced. Luxemburg emphasized how imperialism is a feature of capitalism's need for an outside. Capitalism always relies on materials and labor that it does not produce. But what happens when capitalism is global? It turns in on itself, generating, enclosing, and mining features of human life through digital networks and mass personalized media. This reflexivization produces power laws, extreme inequality, new lords and serfs, vast fortunes, and the parcelized sovereignties that secure this inequality while the many wander and languish in the hinterlands. Thank you. Stand up.
Okay, that's fine.
If maybe then
you can open up any questions you may have.
Jodi, that was magnificent.
Thank you.
A couple of thoughts about old feudalism, whether there's any projection to neo-feudalism. Firstly, the role of religion in old feudalism. It always struck me as amazing that the lords went off to the Crusades, often certain death and so on, in the name of a higher force. Is there a higher force in the Neo-feudalism? First question. Secondly, the old feudalism was characterised between wars between the barons, between the feudal lords, this continual warfare wherein the peasants became subject to the liege requirements and went off to fight for their lords. Do you see any particular sort of focus in that? That would be.
Those are such wonderful comments. I really appreciate them. That's actually, just one aside. So I was trying to decide like what paper to give here because I should be plugging my new book, which will be out in September. It's called Comrade: An Essay on Political Belonging, published by Verso, September. But I decided I didn't want to do that because like it's not like the comments are going to help. At this point, it's not going to change anything. But by doing something new, then I get the benefit of y'all's smart remarks. And this is a good one. So the way you ask the question makes it interesting, like it has to be yes for both. But I've been like I've got a bad disposition against thinking about religion. And what you've reminded me is that, get over it. You have to, because it is crucial, and we see it in the present. And then actually neo-feudalism provides a framework for thinking about how these things, combine with each other. So, and I think the same thing with warfare. So I appreciate the comment. Those are really helpful for me.
Thank you very much. Listening to you talk and reading your work is good for my political soul. Anyway, this isn't feedback that might help you with this work you're working on now, but just when I try to have these types of arguments about getting past this kind of capitalist realism and thinking beyond liberalism and all this stuff, oftentimes I find people with me up until the point I mentioned communism and a party. And I'm assuming that I'm not alone in this, and it makes me wonder, is communism as the signifier just too problematic because of the baggage it brings with it, and people automatically, I find, become less willing to talk about issues that they were with me up until that point?
So I want to break your question into a couple of things. So one thing, when we're engaged in a specific activist practice. So let's say, I did a bunch of anti-fracking pipeline struggle stuff. And I was doing it because I was like, oh, great, if we stop these corporations from doing that, that undermines corporate authority and provides a kind of inroad into an anti-capitalist struggle. But it's not like, standing on the, at the blockade, that's what I said to everybody all the time, right? That wouldn't have been terribly useful, and it wasn't necessary. Or I do other local organizing in Geneva, New York, and we have, I would say, a communist horizon, but it's not like something that we say all the time in organizing because it's not necessarily, it affects how we think about what we do, but it may not always be the best thing or a necessary thing in organizing in specific struggles. So the first thing is just just thinking about what are our terrains and when do particular vocabularies, when are they useful? The next thing is on, I would like to see more intellectuals joining the communist turn and theorizing communism in ways that bring out its openness, its liveliness, its power as a political ideal, and not reducing it to a very specific set of experiments that lasted less than a century. It seems to me like I'm not ready to throw away the category. Primarily because I think communism is the one name that we have for anti-capitalism, right? That anything like social democracy is thinks that you can have a kinder, gentler capitalism, and then it gave up on that. So I think the one political name that we have for building a society that is not capitalist is communism.
Thanks. Thanks for the lecture. My question, I have two questions. First is, do you agree that there's a correlation between the rise of the popularity of certain populist strategies and what you call neo-feudalism. And if you read it, there's a correlation. How do you assess this kind of dual rise? And what is the relationship between the rise of populism and like a newly feudal society in that sense, or seemingly feudal relationships?
Yeah, so in part I want to try to break the hold of the language of populism a bit, but it seems to me that what we can see is deep sets of forms of, I think that's why I like this hinterland idea of people's loss of opportunity, the degradation and decay and diminution of their lives and life's chances, and the failure to find an alternative within the prevailing liberal democratic establishment. And so I think of populism as primarily the liberal name for a democracy they don't like, but it also seems that the movements are not necessarily, it doesn't make sense for me to call them democratic. I don't see why that name makes sense. I think we can see forms of popular anger and frustration born because of the way that, that capitalism has unfolded, and that it is primarily an issue of the economy. And as long as any left fails to make the economy the focus and saying, okay, we have to get rid of this, then we're going to be doomed to the continued rise of discontent among the people who are left out, and they will be available for their anger to be captured by other forces. Right? So I think that the primary, oh yeah, thank you, thanks.
Yeah, you mentioned that localism affirms parcelation in the part where you talked about communist alternatives, and then you mentioned later on because it blocks us from creating a new international. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, like I'm in this question too, but I don't know if we really have to put up like the localism in it, because like the local presents the sphere where we can organize our particularities actually, and if it's not just the translation into the universal desire, which we don't have yet. And on a practical level, like on an activist level, I would ask like, maybe there's just a lack of the platform where we can organize our particularities, which comes from the local, and then maybe put it on the global scale. And I wanted to ask you if you ever thought about this connection between this global local nexus, as it's called in Robertson's ideas of the culture, as it organizes itself in globalization. Because I think there's there's still potential for a new communist movement or socialist movement, as you want to call it, like in this global local nexus. I wouldn't put it always, especially immediately on the nation state, because I think there's a desire in communist movements to see the nation state as the first basis to organize itself. But I think the popular people, they need the local, the base, like the quotidian desire of feelings of other people and the local languages to actually desire something more.
Yeah, so my argument is that actually we can take that the local is not to be abandoned. It just has to be understood as not just local. It's got to be linked locals, associated locals, right? Rather than just this kind of fetishization of the local, which has been so prominent for the last 20 or 30 years. And I think the vehicle is not, I mean, sometimes these days I think we tend to overuse the word platform, but the platform's the party. Right? The party is the form of organization that scales and that makes small struggles always part of another struggle, both in the imaginary, but also practically, right? It gives it provides forms of material support, forms of symbolic support and echoing behavior. So it's a party form that actually helps make the local more than the local. I mean, just one other thing, in terms of on the level of like intuitions, I mean, I think most of us who do local politics also recognize that nobody else ever wants to hear about it, right? It's like, well, you're completely absorbed in your local politics and like these groups and they did that and blah, blah, blah. And it's just like almost the same everywhere with some little nuance maybe, but you end up in a kind of sort of suffocating specificity of the local that never is, or that rarely is able to jump. Right, to become more than itself, and then the kind of organizations that make that more possible are an organization like the party form.
Well, I think kind of you already referred to my concern about To put it in a very straightforward manner, what would be the role of the state in a communist future, and whether you agree with Zizek's proposal of bureaucratic socialism?
I really, this is one of the places where I think that I have some overlap and agreement with Chantal Mouffe is wanting to focus political theory's interest on tactics, transition, struggle, means, and not ends. Right? I think it's that theorists kind of shouldn't all pretend to be, lawgivers, providing constitutions for everybody, and that we shouldn't pretend that we know what the outcome's going to be. So, I don't have an answer for that. Because I also think that we should focus on the struggle and the tactics and how to even have the possibility to have that kind of conversation.
First, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. But in fact, now I am facing an intellectual challenge, because I completely agree with everything that you said. I think it's the reality, so I agree with it. But on the other hand, I've been working a lot on psychoanalysis recently, and with the logical approach, etc., and the phantasmatic logics. And one thing that we learn by reading Lacan and others is that although we may find really true things on our antagonism, so the other really, the bourgeoisie is really exploiting us and creating serious problems in our society. On the other hand, what I'm afraid is that we ended up in a scapegoating moment, let's say, instead of accepting to a certain extent that we will always have problems. I mean, our society will always be imperfect, and the subject will always be splitted. Instead of it, we kind of idealize a world when we got rid of our enemies. And why I am shared, why I say that I'm facing a challenge, because on the one hand, I completely agree with your prescriptions, let's say, with communism, etc. On the other hand, I am afraid, and I know that in the beginning you said, no, it's not beyond politics. In communism there is still politics, but what I am afraid is how to distinguish communism from scapegoating, let's say, from the logic of, let's find someone who is responsible for our misfortune. So thank you very much anyway.
Thanks. I don't think that blaming. I don't think that. Well, let me. So first, a rejection of capitalism is a rejection of the capitalist system. It's a rejection of the system of production. So that's the first thing, and it is a politics oriented to changing the system of production so that the system of production does not benefit the accumulation strategies of the few, of the bourgeoisie, right, the capitalist class. Now, the capitalist class doesn't have to defend their wealth. They could say, God, yes, you're right. Climate change, we can't do that if we keep, just trying to, let's say, sell oil and gas. So they could join us. We're not telling them in advance, off with their heads, right? But if they don't, then that's their call. Right? So there's a fundamental division here, right? And that, the division is class, and this formulation is class struggle, but it's not a naturalized division that refuses to let people move from the bad side to the good side.
Hello. First, thank you very much for your presentation and your very thoughtful remarks. It actually made me want to read more about communicated capitalism and other things like that. But I have two questions, thoughts. You said that the name of the alternative we have on capitalism right now is communism. And you seem focused on this kind of party politics, which I understand, but don't you think that, saying that the only alternative we have now on capitalism is communism kind of undermines maybe our political struggles that are happening right now globally, that are focused on non-parliamentary politics, like democratic federalism or anarchist struggles that have proven themselves to be, really dangerous adversaries to capitalism, like in the case of Kurdistan and Rojava. I shouldn't maybe starting to change a little our language because, for example, there are many anarchists that also define themselves as communists. But there is also the danger, like in the case, I'm from Greece, so we have the recent experience of Syriza, of organizing politics in such way, in such parliamentary, and systemic way, for this kind of communist and radical leftist language to be assimilated inside, capitalism and neoliberal policies. So, do you think about this kind of perspective of organizing politics or doing critical theory and practice, outside of parliamentary politics and through a different definition of the party? Because I don't really know how you have it in your mind. If you have it in the old traditional sense, or you have something else in your mind. That's it.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, first, when I speak about the party, I don't have in mind primarily parliamentary politics. I'm thinking much more of a revolutionary party, but a revolutionary party might also choose sometimes to engage in parliamentary politics. It's also the case that, so I'm interested in that form as a form that can scale and that has a degree of flexibility built into it. It's also the case, the Black Panther Party in the US did not pursue parliamentary politics and pursued forms of community self-help. And so it still was within a party, it's self-understood as a party, but it pursued forms of action that are much broader. I would want to emphasize that way I want to emphasize that line. So, look, this is a position, right? I'm staking out a position. That doesn't mean I've erased other things that are out there, right? They still exist. So I'm making an argument, my own view is I don't think that the Rojava experience is one that can be modeled in very many places. And so I think, that's just kind of, it's not like I think there's anything, not cool about what they're doing, but I don't think that it has at this point. It might in the future. It's also interesting that they have a party, so it's not an alternative to the party form at all. So I don't think that it's, so I think we can, I still want to hold on to communism as the only name that we have for an alternative, and anarcho-communists would agree with me, and anarcho-libertarians would not, so.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I have a question that goes in the same direction, because I was thinking when you're shifting from capitalism to something worse, Neo-feudalism, there must be some sort of change in the actor for communism. And now you're talking about the party that's forcing this communism against Neo-feudalism. But if I understand it correct, it's a party that is connected to some sort of class in the international context. But like Marxist tradition, we have to recognize that we all are part of this class, so there must be some sort of self-identification for this class in the context against neo-feudalism. And then I was thinking about the platform as a party in the context of how is a party communicating with people through discursive or through communicative structures in capitalism. So they are actually not really a good platform for self-identification against neo-feudalism. So we have to think about maybe where to crack this neo-feudalism if we only can use his own infrastructures.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. That's interesting. So first, it's always been the case that struggle is dependent on the things that are being struggled against, right? It's always the case. historic, I mean, it's just, we're not outside, right? So, I mean, when people say like, oh, you know, don't do that kind of struggle, like strikes are elitist because people have to give up their wages. It's like, what are you talking about, right? It is the strength and solidarity of workers who are willing to stand together and with this sacrifice to do something else. So I first think is that we have to recognize that we're inside, right? So that's the first thing. With respect to communicative capitalism, you are absolutely right. That is one of the problems we are in. We are utterly absorbed in it. But I think that with respect to struggle, we can try to focus as much as possible on building face-to-face, close relations. We can focus as much as possible on changing our media habits, in encouraging some kinds of media habits and discouraging other kinds. Is that in any way an escape from it? Absolutely not. But it's one of the conditions that we're finding ourselves in. I think that the hard and interesting question is the class nature of the party and of the struggle. So in Crowds and Party, I make an argument that is an effort to try to recognize that I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, basically. I want to say that I want to recognize the change in what in the character of the working class globally, right? As in, it doesn't make sense, particularly in Europe and the United States, to focus on an industrial working class. We have to have we recognize that there's a whole slew of proletarianized people in service sector jobs, and still in some forms of factory labor. Right? We've got as well as the unemployed. But so we have I want to have this much broader understanding of workers, producers. Now, and in this stuff, I'm suggesting like serfs or service sector as a broad class of the proletarianized. But does this mean that they have any class self-understanding, or that it's the party's role to emphasize the class nature? I'm not convinced that that's the case. What I'm convinced of is that it has to be understood as a struggle for communism, a struggle against capitalist conditions, rather than one that's built first in the affirmation of a class consciousness. I want to build the affirmation of a communist consciousness. So it's not one that I'm saying is first dependent on a specific class carrier or class consciousness. Now, I actually don't think this should be a hard sell, because most of the people who go out in the streets and protest are not the very rich, right? They don't need to go out in the street and protest because they already control the heights of the political system, right? They can get what they want with money. So in fact, if we look at the way that crowds amass, if we look at the way movements struggle, we can actually recognize a very broad understanding of the proletarianized and dispossessed and furious about the conditions of exploitation and expropriation of neo-feudalism.
Hi, I was wondering if you think it's useful to maintain a conceptual distinction between strategy and tactics as a question of scale, but also qualitative difference, or an awareness of how contradiction can arise between the two levels. I think this is, picking up maybe on some of the previous questions, but also on Chantal's presentation yesterday, where it seemed like her interest in populism was a tactical interest rather than a strategic interest. I wonder if you have similar thoughts, especially since it seems that this distinction is one of the greatest resources, maybe burdens also, but resources of communist thought.
I gotta be honest, I always get confused by it. I gotta tell you, I was like, wait a minute, is X a strategy or is X a tactic? I have not found it all that helpful. Right? I mean, I think that, there's, particularly if you think of like Lenin, because his flexibility was such that he could move from multiple levels all the time. So I've not been persuaded that I can basically like see more clearly or win good points with that distinction.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It's a short one. You have given a lot of American examples, and recently, in the past months, maybe a couple of years, we've seen the rise of labels like democratic socialism, political revolution, and so on and so forth, entering the mainstream political discourse in the States. Does this bring us any closer to the ideal of communist struggle, or is this something else, in your opinion?
Thanks for that. I associate those. I associate that with Bernie Sanders, and I think. That's in the U.S. context, right? And I think that's been a tremendous opening in the U.S. We're a really hardcore capitalist society where things like bicycles are considered communist. I'm not joking, right? That's actually true. Obama was trashed as a communist. So there's all sorts of things because of our legacy of Cold War legacy and anti-communist legacy that has made even the most y'all still have health care, right? The most minor things are demonized as communist, and so. To be able to make socialism mainstream in the US is a tremendous achievement. It brings more and more people into political struggle. It makes young people who never would have been thinking about other alternatives start to learn more about it. So I think it is absolutely great and important.
Jodi, thanks. That was brilliant. Thank you. I was going to go back to the conversation that we started to have last night at dinner, but I'm going to try and do a better job of it. So you've outlined a set of what I would say structural features of this emerging neo-feudalism. But I suppose my question is, what about, and it slightly relates to the question that came up over here in terms of critical fantasy and so on. I'm wondering what the kind of corresponding sort of libidinal economy is that accompanies this nascent neo-feudalism. And I suppose I'm kind of drawing on the work of Cordella here, who asserts that actually the unconscious and the surplus enjoyment and the commanded enjoyment libidinal economy that goes with it only becomes operative in this transition from feudalism to capitalism. And you outlined that actually what you were seeing in terms of kind of subjectivity, there are certain symptoms around increased suicide rates, levels of anxiety, and so on and so forth. And I wonder if that actually isn't because we're kind of caught between two systems in a sense, that we're kind of structurally dominated, but we kind of think we're free, and that's where the kind of anxiety arises. But I suppose my question is whether you can see in this kind of in the emergence, or whether you're seeing any evidence of a parallel emergence of a different kind of libidinal economy under neo-feudalism. And I suppose kind of last night I was sort of saying actually that could be a good thing, right? Because when we're just sort of within the kind of discourse of the master, we have a certain sort of freedom, right? We don't have to kind of worry about our surplus enjoyment anymore. We can just get on and enjoy it, not for real, as it were. But I'm not suggesting that makes neo-feudalism a good thing.
Right, thanks for that. I'm going to have to answer not in terms of Karina Cordelia, but I will. I think that's a good suggestion there for me to look at as I build this up. So, I view the present in terms of a concept that Zizek talks about in the last chapter of The Ticklish Subject, where he mentions the decline of symbolic efficiency. And the decline of, is that clear? Do I need to say what that means? A little bit of, so, symbolic efficiency is like, we know what people mean when they say something, right? We know what a symbol means. Like if I'm wearing like a cross, you might think I'm a very religious person, or if I'm wearing it in a particular way, you might think I'm Madonna or something like this, right? So, but we have a general sense of what things mean. And the decline of symbolic efficiency is that symbols have lost their signifying capacity. They're not efficiently transmitted. If you've been in discussions, this happens now, like all the time. You have to spend most of the discussion figuring out, are we talking about the same thing? We're using the same words, but we have no idea what anybody means. So I think of our general situation in terms of the decline of symbolic efficiency, which then means that's the loss of the paternal signifier. It means that it's a general situation then, and this is where I don't fully agree with some of Zizek's moves. I'd say that this is then the situation of the circulation of drive. right? So that there's always enjoyment. We can't escape it. It's not a setting that's marked by desire or a master. It's a psychotic kind of always staying by enjoyment situation. And that means that people feel like this kind of intense degrees of paranoia, intense degrees of feeling of encroachment. You're always already violated. You're always already at risk. You're never safe enough, right? The presence of another is always completely shattering, right? You just and so I think that this is part of our situation. And then I would say that for that we might be, one way to think about the subjectivity battle is, are there battles over the impositions of new forms, of new possible symbolic orders? That's one of the reasons I like the party. I mean, I think that the party is that kind of form for its members. And even for fellow travelers, right? Even people who didn't agree with the Communist Party still saw it as a strong signifier. So it doesn't completely, and so what I don't want to say though is that there are particular political carriers of neo-feudalism. I don't want to make that mapping, right? Like that all right people are neo-feudalism. I think it is a structural development that's coming out of the dynamics of communicative capitalism. And then we'll have political reactions to and responsive to it, and that's the field of struggle we're in. And then the left needs to be mindful of this and not exacerbate tendencies to neo-feudalism. Instead, think of ways to push the fight in a different direction.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture. I just have a question about the applicability of creating a communist successful movement in other places that are not in the West. So, for example, in the Middle East, where it is very feudal, and also that perhaps in the Middle East there's a negative connotation to communism, where it's viewed as
sort of everywhere.
Oh, well, yeah. You're right, yeah, absolutely. But Middle East being the Middle East takes it to another level. So I think because it's viewed as this very godless movement, and always just like what you mentioned in the United States, where anything that's not remotely communist is immediately looked at as communist. So I wonder if in addition to, a very strong capitalist phenomenon there as well in the Middle East, from outside an international presence. But I wonder, do you think that, what kind of challenges would this movement face in a place that's very dense with different identities and especially an unfriendly place to communism in a place like the Middle East?
Thanks for that. First, a set of first efforts would be to recover the real communist history that's also been part of struggles in the Middle East, right? Like the Palestinian former different communist parties there were really important. Yemen had a very successful socialist government for a while. So I think that the first thing would be, Iranian communist is still fairly strong, they've got those groups. So I think the first thing is getting away from a cloaking of the Middle East under a supposition of a kind of all religion, all religiosity, and not seeing the other kinds of histories and projects and struggles that have been going on. So that's the first thing. Because, in fact, it's actually the global West that has been much more hostile to communism than, say, India, which has strong communist parties, the revolution in Nepal that was successful, and then the more complex case of China. So I think that my examples, yeah, right. So my examples come from things I'm familiar with, because I don't want to pretend to speak for all sorts of groups. But I think those histories are vital.
Hello.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm thinking a lot, and I was trying to connect you were talking about an open space, or space gained by the use of the signifier socialism,
by the Socialist Democrats, for instance, in the United States. And I cannot but link that to the experience of Latin America. Hugo Chavez as someone that decided to put the signifier of socialism back in the agenda everywhere that nobody wanted to speak about it. He used the word. And thinking through that experience and other experiences such as, for instance, the Cuban Revolution, at the beginning they were seeing the communists as groups that were frustrating popular processes, mainly because they thought, for instance, in Cuba, that the strike had to be in the cities and there were no conditions for an armed struggle, or the famous interviews of Hugo Chavez at the beginning saying, I am not a communist, I am not a communist, I am not a communist. So the importance of disputing the national popular signifier in the construction of an open space in which then the signification by socialism can be stressed as a form of seeing a different horizon from capitalism, trying to accelerate, let's say, that process. So I guess I have three questions for you. The first one is the role of the national popular, if it's important. The second one is if communism should be stressed necessarily or should be constructed through local struggles. And the third one would be the role of leadership. Thank you.
The question of, I'm going to do I'm not going to answer them. I'm not going to answer them in order. I never know how this microphone. It's so weird. So on the should communism be stressed? I mean, a lot depends on local. On the conditions of struggle that one's in, or that that the group is in, that's being that's present, and what's going to work in that place, right? So, I think that it's really crucial to hold open to keep a communist signifier alive, to invest it with purpose, and because of its histories and legacies that are positive. Right, with respect to the achievements of working class struggle. So I think that that's important. But that might not mean that every single struggle all the time has to go around with a hammer and sickle, right? That's a much more practical kind of question. So second thing, on the national popular, the way I find Lenin helpful on thinking about these kinds of struggles, because he emphasizes the crucial role of struggles for self-determination of oppressed national minorities. And so rather than beginning with a sense of so what he looks at is is to say, hey, look, Communist Party, you guys shouldn't just think that only working class struggles matter, because sometimes these struggles are going to come in really different directions and be led by different groups. And particularly under conditions of imperialism, these are going to be struggles for national self-determination. So be mindful of that. And with that argument, then you can start to analyze the different groups within a national struggle and know something about them. So not all nationalism is good nationalism, but some might be the fight and struggle of an oppressed national minority. So that part I find really useful, and that language works better for me than the language of national popular and the Gramscian idiom, right? So, but that might be a matter of kind of like theoretical taste, what kinds of text one finds meaningful, rather than some kind of strong disagreement. I don't know. On leadership, I mean, I think we need to talk more about following. And I think that too many intellectuals only want to worry about leadership. And intellectuals are the worst for actually following, for kind of accepting the leadership of others, people who may not have degrees and all of this sort of stuff, and saying no, it's the people on the ground who are doing the work, and we need to learn to follow them. So I think on leadership, I mean, sometimes when I get this question, people are thinking oh, are you asserting a vanguard party? It's a vanguard's only a vanguard if people follow it. And so the real thing that actually matters is a willingness to kind of follow, a willingness to kind of put ego aside and do the work of struggle.
Make this the last lecture.
Oh, now there's a lot of pressure to make it a question. Thank you so much for your talk. Myself and my colleagues who are not here, because I'm from Sydney, which is criminally far away, we all love you very much.
Oh my God, that's so nice.
But I just want to ask your thoughts on what you were saying about the power of corporations, the fact that, as you said, corporations sometimes have incomes that exceed a country's GDP, and people have sort of taken this out and expanded it out to mean that corporations sort of have sovereignty unto themselves, and then of course you have people who critique that view and say that, well, no, I mean, if you look at the TNCs in the world, most of them are based in the United States, this is just US hegemony, and this is also just the persistence of state sovereignty, right? So if we look at, for example, the practices of Nestle in Thailand, right? People say, oh, well, Nestle is responsible for the fact that people are doing shrimp farming as slaves in Thailand. They say, well, that's Nestle. And then, of course, people counter that and say, well, no, it's the Thai government who's not standing away and doing anything about it. So I just wonder if you haven't, or if you think it's even important to talk about whether or not this sovereignty issue is salient.
Thanks for that. The way I think Lenin's helpful on this because of his understanding of imperialism, right? So what imperialism makes us think about is the way that the interest of monopoly corporations are extensions of imperialist interest of state power. So it's not one and the same, they're operators together. And the way that then they divide up the world, the way that this view clearly relies on the idea that there's uneven development, that some countries are going to definitely end up being constantly screwed, and that you have to recognize that, so it's, you don't have to make a choice on that one. It's not like, a good corporation, bad US. It's like, it's all vehicles for this imperialist power. So, thanks. Thank you, guys.
Can I take this opportunity to thank Jodi for her wonderful talk today and for patiently and enthusiastically answering your questions in the usual fashion.
Thank you.